Oops. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for being interactive and all your great questions and comments. I appreciate that. And I know there are more kind of floating through the room, and so keep continuing to feel like you can do that. So this one, we're going to talk about connections. How do we move from this feeling of being caught in between it to having some kind of freedom and space in our relationships? And so the question of kind of why is there always drama in our relationships? And Pastor Paul kind of referred, because we're not mature, because we are offendable, we are defensive. And so I want to kind of show you I think this is just a helpful way of understanding anxiety, because I think when you think about any of those conversations that don't go well, if you're able to kind of pause and check in with yourself, you probably feel that rise coming up, the adrenaline going, the heart kind of getting there, something in you is physiologically responding to whatever the people are sharing that's difficult for you. And so this is just a way of kind of understanding what's happening when we start to feel anxious. And so this is a very simplified explanation of the brain. So if you imagine this is the brain, this is the brain stem, this is the midbrain, and within this part of the brain is the amygdala. This is our emotion center of our brain. And this is where we have the fight, flight, or freeze response. And this is it's our kind of instinctive brain. This is the part of the brain that we share with animals. And this is a brain at calm, at rest. This part of the brain is our higher functioning. This is our executive functioning, our cognitive place that we engage. So when we're reactive, we're in this part of our brain. When we're here, we're responding because we're thinking about it. And so when something has triggered us, the interesting thing about the amygdala, the hippocampus is kind of our memory seat of the brain. If there's any medical doctors in here, I may be butchering this anatomy, but it makes sense. The hippocampus is kind of right next to the amygdala, and that's our memory seat. And so it makes sense for survival in the way God created us. If we're in some kind of a threatening situation, then we're going to store that memory because we want to make sure we avoid danger next time. So whatever was evoking of us or scary or threatening, we feel that viscerally. The part about this part of the brain is that, again, it's not our higher order thinking. So this doesn't distinguish is this physical danger or emotional danger. And so when we're in relationships, there's no danger probably, most often, that we're going to be attacked physically, but verbally, it may be there. And so our survival instinct heightens up if we're aware of some kind of threat that's emotional. And the memory part of that is if this particular person triggers us or this particular dynamic in our family is difficult, then we walk back into that. And our brain says, uh-oh, this is dangerous. This might not go well. They're not going to be respectful. And so we enter into it already with this kind of heightened sense of, I need to have my guard up. I need to either be ready to fight or to run away or to freeze up. And so when this part of the brain is activated, we feel it physiologically. And it's as if our brain is like it's flashing danger. And I was thinking about this, and I don't know if you guys... Who watched the TV show Lost in Space? A few, okay, good. So I thought, and it was like when I'm thinking about this, do you remember the robot? I don't know if it had a name, but when he was like, his arms would flail and he's like, danger, Will Robbins, danger. And so that's kind of what I think is happening. And it's funny because I thought, it was actually as I was going to bed last night, and I thought, I probably could have Googled Lost in Space. And that's the difference between me and my kids. If I ask them something, it's like, well, Google it. It's like, oh, yeah. We're not used to the fact that anything we want to ever know, we can just go on the computer and find. So anyway, that's an aside. But that's the picture. When that's happening, it's like your brain is flashing danger. And what happens when you're in this state where your adrenaline is going, the oxygen leaves our brain because it needs to get to our extremities, to run, it shuts down our digestion. We're in that mode to survive. And so if you notice, when you get in some of those conversations, you sometimes feel foggy, you feel like you don't know what you're saying or thinking, because the oxygen is not in your brain. And we need oxygen in our brain to think, to have a reasonable response. And so that's where a big part, when you're noticing your brain is in this flashing pattern. And I think this, again, is so interesting in the way God created us, that when you've thought you were in danger and then you realize that you're safe, what's instinctive that we do? Right, sigh of relief, because what that does, it takes all the oxygen, we get it back into our brain so we can think. And this is kind of an on-off switch. So when our brain is flashing, we're reactive, we're defensive. If we can catch that, take a deep breath, maybe even take ourselves away if we need to, and engage our thinking brain, we turn off the reactive brain. And so kind of just that awareness of what's happening, and the same thing with our kids. Maybe we're not reactive, or our parents, but we're watching the emotion rise in the people that we're talking to. To notice that and be like, okay, wait, maybe, let's take a deep breath. Maybe let's come back in 5 minutes, or whatever you might need to do. Excuse me, I'm gonna grab my water here. So I think it's just that awareness of what's happening that is creating the drama. All right, so what can we do about it, and how can we understand what happens when the reactivity comes up? What do? We kind of go into these roles. And someone named Stephen Cartman, back in '61, came up with this model that I think is really a helpful way of looking at it. He called it the drama triangle. And the idea is within family systems that we all kind of naturally fall into these different roles when we're engaging in, thank you, Scott, when we're engaging in family dynamics or any relation. It can be a family, or it could even be a one-on-one. We can see these roles playing out. So the first role is a persecutor. And this is the person, they're attacking, they're blaming, they're in the fight mode. Their survival method said fight, attack. And so these are the kind of words you might hear from a persecutor. Just I'll say, all of us have done all of these probably. So I'm in here with it, so we're not pointing fingers. We're just kind of trying to recognize what's happening when we're feeling. Sometimes we're not saying it out loud, but we're sure feeling it inside. Thinking that we're not saying it, but everything in our demeanor is probably still persecuting. How dare you? It's all your fault. What were you thinking? I never said or did that. And this is kind of this gaslighting. I don't know, this is a term that is thrown around a lot now in the younger generation, but it's a powerful way of recognizing when someone says, I didn't say that, or you must have heard me wrong. And what that creates in the receiver is, am I crazy, or did that happen that way? And so that it's just this kind of blame shifting to be like, no, I didn't ever do that. And this is just the way I am. Kind of get over it, get used to it. You should be ashamed of yourself. This is a phrase that I think as parents have probably used. I know my mom used it on me a lot. I think it was a normal thing to say, and yet when you think about it, especially in context of the developmental stages, this idea of shame, you should take on shame, is just something we don't ever want to put on someone. And then if you could just be more like so-and-so, or someone else does it better. So the persecutor then often creates the victim, who's the one that often is getting that attack, which creates in them this sense of powerlessness, helplessness. And they're going to say things like, poor me, nobody cares about me. It's not fair. It's all my fault. I don't know. I don't care. I think this, when I have people in my office, I feel like so often someone is like, I don't know. And it shows that kind of formative years that all agency was kind of taken from them. And so the idea, and some of what we talked about, that confusion, I thought I knew, but then the voices in my world told me I didn't know. And so that's kind of their defense is, I don't know, I don't care, I can't, I give up, it's no use, I'm not enough. Again, kind of we see where that comes out of. And then we have the rescuer. So often in a family dynamic, you've got the persecutor, you've got the poor victim, And then the savior, the rescuer who comes in and, well, let me fix it. Well, he didn't mean that. Oh, it's okay. You're okay. Let's just make it all better. And so what a rescuer says is, here, let me do that for you. Let me take care of that. You should or you shouldn't. The rescuer wants to give the advice because they know exactly how somebody should be doing their life. That's okay, it was all my fault. Maybe something stirred up and we want to quickly say, oh, never mind, it was my fault. Never mind, I don't mean that. Let me fix it for you. Your needs are more important than mine. Let me take care of you. It's okay, I don't matter. I'll take care of it. And within this is this internal message that I cannot disappoint anyone. And so the rescuer is exhausting themselves with doing what this person needs and doing this person needs and doing, their goal is I must please because somehow that's the way I feel good about me, is if I can please everybody around me. And then they feel like nobody appreciates me. Look at all this that I did, and they don't even care. They didn't even say thank you. They didn't even say they were sorry. So then, where does the rescuer go? He becomes a persecutor. How dare you? I did all this for you and you didn't even appreciate it? How dare you? Or now I'm the victim because poor me. Nobody appreciates everything that I'm doing for him. And so we circle around and around in this cycle. So if you think about it, what would be some of the emotions that are going to be flying around this kind of a dynamic? What words come to mind that people would be feeling? Anger, frustration, shame. Was that? Resentment, yep. Hopelessness, Trapped. Yeah, those are good. I think you got most of them. Criticism. I think sometimes someone's like, well, I'm not angry, but there's this low simmering criticism constantly. What about this? Why didn't you do that? And so we kind of can deny or lie to ourselves. We're not angry, but we're constantly judging and criticizing. Abuse is going to come out of this kind of relationship because there's a total lack of respect among the members. Fear, insecurity. Jealousy, this is an interesting one because I think a lot of times with young adults, and as we talked about that intimacy stage, someone finally finds someone who's interested in them, and this person is so interested that they want them all to themselves, and they can't have any other friends, and they need to control what they wear and what they do. And for a while, this person feels so loved because this person just can't get enough of me. But within this is this really powerful control and manipulation and dominance that eventually then becomes clear, but yet in those initial stages, this longing to belong and to be enough and to be loved kind of creates this ability for someone to come into that kind of relationship and not even realize where they are. Codependency is another big one that comes with the rescuer to victim. Any thoughts or questions before so when we're going to move into then is say we recognize this, how do we move out of it? But I want to just pause for a minute. Is anyone clear? Okay. So the way we move out of it, and this is the idea about how do we cultivate connections? How do we recognize this drama and try to kind of step out of it? And I think the idea when this is the way the families work, also I should have had on there secrets. Secrets are a big part of that other kind of dynamic. Because if anyone knew how crazy this is, it would be terrible. So we don't talk about what dad does or mom does or whatever. Or the kids. Oh, my kids are great. They're, So I just think there's those secrets to others and often kind of denial in ourselves in that past way. And so the idea of cultivating connections involves stepping out. If you kind of think about it like a boat, and when you go home to a family dynamic, you're like, well, but if I did something different, it would rock the boat. Like, it's just easier to keep it safe, keep it the way it is. Because stepping out of the boat will rock it. But until you step out of it, you will constantly be pulled into this kind of a cycle. And so often, too, when you're in a relationship and you're feeling manipulated or controlled or angry or any of those emotions we talked about, is a good warning sign for you to kind of pause and think, am I playing one of these roles right now? And how do I kind of move out of that? So the idea, instead of being caught, is just breathing free. And I think that's what our hope in relationships is, that we create space. And I often talk about, it's not so much the people in relationship, it's what's the space in between like. How safe does it feel? How open does it feel? How vulnerable is this space that is created between us? And that's the way we cultivate a connection. So the first one is to move from being a persecutor to a collaborator. So a collaborator is going to say things like, help me to understand. So rather than attacking, like, tell me more, help me understand what's going on. What's it like for you? To try to understand someone else's story before we kind of react to our own. The recognition that you have, whoever is being, doing whatever is upsetting, it's like to recognize that everyone has their own story and their own pain. To be able to say, I forgive you. And this is a big one, I think, even people who don't have a religious faith, I think forgiveness is such an important thing to understand. Forgiveness does not mean that's okay, it's all right. Forgiveness means I will no longer hold that. I think of it like a ball and chain, kind of when someone has done something hurtful, and there are legitimately hurtful things that we won't forget, and we should not trust a person who's done that, perhaps. But it's like we're dragging this ball and chain with us our whole lives when we continue to feel bitter and resentful and absorbed by that, rather than kind of disconnecting it and saying, it's there. I'm not dismissing what happened. I'm not saying it didn't matter and it didn't hurt, but I'm not going to carry it anymore. I forgive you. I release you from that. How can we work together? Recognizing that we're all responsible for our own choices in relationships. And then this idea that we can create healthy boundaries to help ourselves kind of navigate between us in a healthier way. And then the victim moves from a victim to being a victor, kind of growing in their own capability, their own confidence. So they're going to say things like, I am finding my own voice. I am learning and growing. And I think this learning and growing is such an important one with people in my office so often. It's like, well, I messed up again, or I did this again. And it's like, it's not perfection. It's, are you learning? Are you growing? Is there something you can take away from that? Because if we're learning and growing, we're making progress. I can do hard things. I am responsible for my own choices. I think that's a key one for someone to move out of being a victim, to realize I have choices. They may be difficult, but I have choices that I can make. I can ask for help when I need it. I am enough. And I will set boundaries to protect myself, recognizing that they have their own choices and they can create boundaries that are going to be nurturing and protective for themselves. And then the last one is to move out of the rescuer role into a helper role. And so I think a really key way to kind of recognize the difference here is, if you remember, the rescuer says, what can I do for you? Or I'll do that for you. And a helper says, how can I help you? You're leaving the agency and the person, and you're saying, how can I come alongside you? I'll walk beside you, but I won't carry you. And I think a big thing about a rescuer, if you have played that role or watched that being played, the rescuer comes over, sweeps up the victim, poor you, here, let me help you, I'll put you down right here. And then the next time the victim needs help, what do? Hey, they haven't learned anything, so okay, I'll kick you back here, okay, there, is that good? Okay, for a little bit longer, and then let me do it again. And so you're exhausted, and what you're communicating to the person you're trying to help is, I know you can't walk on your own. I really don't trust you to be able to do this, so I'll do it for you. And so it's this subtle but powerful message that says, you really need me to do this for you. And so the idea of not being willing to carry someone is saying, I'm going to walk beside you, but I know you can walk. I'm going to help be here with you, but I want to trust you to be able to walk. And then I think this is a key one for parents, to be able to ask when someone is hurting, do you want advice or do you just want me to listen? And that's a really easy phrase to use that I think is really important to kind of tuck into your vocabulary, because it's so easy, whatever the person is sharing. Oh, and we're well-meaning to say, oh, if you just did this, or you should do that. And a lot of times they don't need that, and they don't want that. And that just, they're going to shut it down, and they're going to glaze over, and whatever your ongoing advice is will be totally missed. And so to be able to say, would you rather I just listen? Tell me more about that. I understand it's not easy, and I'm here for you. You can do hard things. I believe in you. I'll set boundaries to empower you. And so part of that is the boundaries that you create as a rescuer says, I will not carry you. And it's a boundary that also, it protects you, but it also empowers the other person. There's something else I was going to say about the helper, and I can't think of it right now. So let's say some words. When you think about this triangle, this breathing free with a collaborator, a helper, and a victor, what are some of the words that are going to be in this space between these relationships? What words come to mind? Respect, yep. Anything else? Empowering, yep. Caring. Safe, yeah, that's a big one, safe. Hope, we talked about that before. Hope is created in this kind of environment. Confidence. You got the other ones. Feeling seen and heard and valued. I remember what I was going to say now about the helper. I think sometimes, especially when we're in tricky situations with someone who continues to play the victim role, we yo-yo back and forth between carrying them and doing everything for them, and then this idea of tough love, which I don't like that term, is like, okay, you're on your own. I can't do this for you. Good luck. And that's not what they need. They need the presence that says, I'm going to show up for you. I'm going to create boundaries that help and empower you, but I'm going to show up for you. I'm going to be here. I can put my arm around you. I'm not going to carry you, but I will be with you. And I think that's so important, because when someone is struggling, they need our support. They need someone to come alongside them. They just don't need to be fixed or carried. And so I think when we think about these words, they are empowering, like you said, and also the idea when someone is acting out in unhealthy ways, like Nancy was talking about, the unhealthy ways of acting out are often going to come out of that other dynamic, right? Because they're insecure and they're fearful and they're unsure and trying to figure out what to do. And when you create these kind of relationships, the potential for someone to find themselves and to act out in a way that feels healthy and mature and empowered is much more likely when you're in these kind of relationships. So again, this idea just kind of moving from a persecutor to a collaborator, moving from a victim to a victor, moving from the rescuer to becoming the helper. And if you notice, kind of one of the things that all of them said when we moved to this other side in the connected side, each one of those said boundaries. And so boundaries is a key part of moving out of each one of those roles that we play, figuring out how do we create healthy boundaries in our relationships. So your wounding is not your fault, and your healing is your responsibility. And I think this is just such a key awareness for us and for the people that we are involved with, that There are people who've had horrific things happen that were not their fault, that should not have happened, that they did not deserve. And to be able to take responsibility and be able to be empowered to move in their life, it doesn't dismiss that that was awful and hurtful and painful. And you're the only one that can create healing for yourself. And so it's that empowering, but without dismissing. And I think sometimes it's like, well, get over it. Or, the victim, like, well, that was a long time ago. You should be fine. And every time we do that, we entrench that victim to want to make sure they convince everybody how terrible it was, because it was. But I think the more we can say, we see that, we see you, we hear you, and we also know that you can grow and learn. So, boundaries. Boundaries revoke. I think boundaries is something it's used a lot, and so we're going to spend a bit of time just really trying to define what they are and what they aren't, and some really practical ways to think about boundaries in our life. So, boundaries are revoking a privilege that someone was never meant to have. Someone has crossed over onto your side, and they've lived there a long time, but that was never their space to inhabit. And a boundary is just saying, no more. This is my space. It allows others to make choices about their own behavior. Helps to make people feel safe. Helps to match our outsides to our insides. And I think so often in relationships, I'm sure we have certain people where there's this churning and uncomfortableness, but we're just going to kind of stomach it and we're going to get through it. And a boundary helps us take what's going on the inside and put it on the outside in a healthy way. It helps us avoid the drama triangle. So a few things, what they are and what they're not. Boundaries are not about control. Boundaries are not about you controlling anybody else. They're about empowerment. They're not about telling others what they should do, but they're more about telling others what you will do to keep yourself safe and healthy. Boundaries are not reactive, but boundaries instead are responsive. Boundaries are not made when we're in this flashing danger zone in our brain. Boundaries are made when we take a breath and we decide, this is what I need in this relationship. Boundaries are not permission to be rude, aggressive, and hurtful. And I think I've seen people use it that way, like, well, I'm creating a boundary, and in that, they're attacking and hurting the other person. Instead, boundaries are clear, they're assertive, they're kind, and they're respectful. Boundaries are not easy and comfortable. They are actually hard and uncomfortable. And when we know that, we can kind of recognize that can be expected as we move. It's uncomfortable to rock the boat. It's uncomfortable to get out and feel the destabilization that may happen. But it's hard and uncomfortable to be in the drama triangle as well, right? Even more hard and uncomfortable. And so that's the idea of, okay, if they're both hard, which one is healthier? And so we make that choice. So the question is, when do we need a boundary? How do we know if we need a boundary? So pay attention to your feelings inside. We're so used to being like, I'll just get through it, it's fine, and all this churns inside, and we're reactive, and we're just trying to ignore it. And so take time to really pay attention. If you're with this person, do you feel dread, unsafe, diminished, less than, manipulated, or somehow crazy? Like you're with them and like, is that just me, or what was it that just happened? That did not feel very good to me. So when you're noticing that, pay attention. Don't just tell yourself, oh, it's not a big deal, it's okay, I'll get through it, because part of it is taking care of you. In the same way that we want to value and acknowledge other people's feelings when we're feeling it, we want to pay attention and say, okay, yeah, that's not okay. We don't need to engage in that kind of a relationship. And the other thing is, if that person is demeaning or hurtful to someone that you love, is maybe a way of you're protecting someone else by creating a boundary. If you notice that you're tolerating this pain of inner conflict in order to avoid the discomfort of outer conflict. And again, recognizing over time, this inner conflict is going to pop out in physical ways, right? When we're feeling this emotional upheaval every time we're engaging with these relationships, physically we're going to begin to feel it. And so, yeah, it may feel easier than avoiding this kind of conflict, but in the end, it's healthier for you. If we're betraying ourselves rather than risk disappointing others. So we'll put our needs down to please our parents or whoever is demanding something of us. When friends or family members offer unsolicited or hurtful feedback or advice. So this is a tricky one because I often have people in my office who are wanting to put a boundary around their parent or their grandparent because they always come in and want to tell them what to do and give them advice that they don't want. And so it goes both ways. It's like that is an uncomfortable place for someone to be. And so, one, we don't want someone doing that to us, and we don't want to be the kind of person that is going to impose that on somebody else. And when the relationship is worth the effort. It's an effort to create boundaries and to make healthy relationships. And so there are some relationships it's like it's not worth that effort. But for the ones that are, for the significant people in our life, it's worth it to engage in making it better. So how do we set a boundary? So first of all, it's just kind of, again, checking in with yourself. And this whole idea, like we talked about in the formative years, the first goal is always of a healthy self to be able to check in, what am I feeling, what do I need, rather than what are all these other voices that I'm so used to listening to. How do I hear my own voice and decide what do I need and how we can work together. And then you make a request to share your needs. And it's both, again, that idea of being heard and hearing. So sharing your needs, but also being aware of that openness to hear what's going to come back. In sharing the needs, to be clear, assertive, respectful, and kind, and avoid passive-aggressive communication, like, oh, you don't have to do that, or oh, that's okay, when really we want to say, no, please don't do that. You know, make it clear what you're asking for. Otherwise, how can someone be expected to be able to respond to what you're requesting? And then if needed, to be able to communicate really clear terms of engagement. So if it's a patterned relationship where it always escalates into something, to be able to be clear, I'm going to walk away if you're going to be disrespect, shame, dismiss, or threaten me. I will walk away. I'm not going to be in a relationship where I don't feel safe, and I'm not going to spend time with you if you're going to be hurtful and attacking of others. And sometimes that, when we brought up the racial issues before, sometimes for the younger generation who they've been very trained and taught about diversity and inclusion and the importance of that, and their hearts genuinely, I believe, feel that. And so it is, when they hear a grandparent make some kind of a comment about maybe a group of people they know or they care about, it feels very hurtful. And so I think in some cases they can be able to say, I'm not going to have conversations like this if they're going to use those kind of derogatory comments about people that they care about. So then how do we reinforce a boundary once we've tried to kind of say clearly what we need? So the idea is kind of minimum dose, maximum effect. Like we start out as gently as we can, kind of in a green zone. And that's where maybe assuming, like again, maybe with the racial comment, assuming they were well-intentioned, they didn't realize what they said or how hurtful it was, and to be able to just say, I appreciate if you would not use that term, and then move on, reinforce it, and then just change the subject. Or if someone is asking or advising something, to be able to say, I'd appreciate if you wouldn't offer me advice. How are you doing? Or so it's acknowledging the issue and then changing the subject. And I think often what we do is just change the subject without saying, I've asked if you would please not do that. So then yellow is if it keeps happening again. Then it's a more direct that might include saying, let's take a break. If the conversation is getting difficult, to say, I think we all just need to kind of take a breath. Let's take a break and come back and try this again. red is when it kind of continues escalating, and you need to kind of say, maybe you're in their home or whatever, and you say, I'm sorry, I need to go. This conversation is uncomfortable. I don't want to be a part of this. I'm going to need to go, and I'll see you later. Black is if nothing changes. And so this is in often like abusive type relationships where you try to create a boundary, you try to express what you need, it doesn't happen. Someone continues to be hurtful, demeaning, disrespectful, and to then at that point kind of decide, maybe this is a relationship that I will not be a part of. And I think what trips up often, Christians with this idea of a commandment that we honor our father and mother. So what if our father and mother are so hurtful or disrespectful of us or our children that it feels like black zone? And so I think, I'm not speaking for God here, but to honor a father and mother, I don't think means we have to submit ourselves into a relationship with them that is hurtful of us or our children. And so I think to be able to say in a kind, respectful, assertive way, this is not okay. If you ever want to apologize or make it right or kind of work through it, I'm willing to have a conversation, but as long as it happens like this, we're not going to be able to spend time together. And I think even within families, that's okay. And I think so often people feel like, but it's family, I have to. And I see people who've engaged in these hurtful relationships year after year after year to the detriment of their own mental health. And that's where knowing how to take care of ourselves is knowing when a relationship is like that, it's okay to say, we need to have a break from each other. And you decide how long that needs to be. Things to remember with boundaries. When you create a boundary, expect someone will be disappointed and, I can't believe you would do that, or, I didn't mean anything, or why would you, that's so mean, you would do that to me. Expect that. They will be disappointed. They will try to manipulate or whatever, and to feel like, if I've chosen this boundary and been clear and respectful in how I've delivered it, I will hold it. I don't, never mind, it's okay. I feel like I tried to do that with my mom sometimes with some parenting things, and I would share some things that when I had little ones that were kind of difficult for me when she would engage, and I would try to kind of tiptoe around a boundary, and then she would feel sad and disappointed. I was like, no, never mind. It's fine, never mind, and back up. And so I think just kind of recognizing if this is important enough to you to say, then hold it. And I think this is a big one when you have issues with in-laws or with kids, and you have a spouse, to try to be on the same page first in deciding how are we going to approach this with our kids or with our parents or in-laws. And then I think this is a big one, to close the gap between when something happens and when you respond authentically. And I think we all, I'm sure, that's a difficult one. Something happens, we come home, we vent to our husbands or our friends or our wives, whatever, and all the stuff, all the feelings that are just churning around, and we sit with it for a long, long time, and maybe eventually it kind of passes away, but again, the next time it triggers, our memory stored it, so that person is always going to bring it up for us. Or we eventually kind of say something, but by then it's so long after the fact that they're like, well, why didn't you say anything? It must not have been a big deal. So the goal is that when we feel something, and one thing that I think is helpful sometimes when it feels scary to say something. When we feel like we've been offended or disrespected, it's hard to know how to do that, especially if we never have. And so one thing I think is helpful is to say, ouch. It's a simple way that kind of just says, that hurt. And sometimes you don't have to go into a big, long explanation, but by someone saying something and you say, ouch, you're acknowledging to yourself, I hear you. I know that hurt. I'm protecting you by speaking it. And it kind of just shows the other person, that wasn't okay. And so again, it's kind of a green level. Like sometimes maybe it's just saying, ouch, when someone says something like that, and see where it goes. But it can be just kind of a simple way rather than thinking, what are the right words? How do I say this? It just at least kind of broaches that to say, this did not feel okay, what just happened. And I think this is just an important thing to keep in mind is that there's no greater betrayal than the abandonment of ourselves. And I think we do that all the time when we dismiss our needs for someone else, when we think, well, it's fine, get over it, you'll be okay. And what we're doing internally is telling ourselves we don't matter, that what we feel isn't important. And over time, again, as you kind of looked at those formative years, that creates this message to yourself, what I feel doesn't matter, and everybody else's needs come before mine. And that creates its own distress over time. And so when people are talking about, trying to think about how do they approach this, and they're ready and they're going to have this conversation, and I always talk about, so what's going to be success? After you have this conversation, how are you going to measure if that felt successful? Because success is not, oh, I got that person to change. We have no control over what anyone else is going to do. We only have control over ourselves. So going into it, not thinking, well, I'm going to say all this and they're going to change and it's all going to be great, but going into it saying, I am going to be true to myself. I am going to use my voice. I'm going to express a clear, kind, assertive boundary. And if I do that, that's success. I validated to me that it matters, that I have choices, that I can be assertive. And whatever they do with it, that's up to them. And it may take a while. The first time, they may be totally shocked. They may attack. Who knows? But when you go into it knowing I can expect any of that, but what my measure is did I use my voice in a way that felt congruent and true for me? So I think this idea that is without control is being held and free at the same time. And I just love this image kind of just open hands that we want to hold our loved ones without controlling them. Because the truth is that we all need support from each other. The older generation needs the younger generation. It enriches our lives when we are able to have this multi-generational impact and connection. We need to understand that each stage of life has its own inherent challenges and opportunities for growth on all ends. And I think as we went through all those, it's just kind of that idea that there's no one stage that's like, oh, this one's easy, no big deal. Each one is new for that person. That person is navigating something they've never navigated before. And so sometimes we look back at our kids and we think, oh, well, yeah, I was a teenager, I know what it's like, but we don't. They're in a different time, they're in a different culture, they're in a different community. So recognizing that and then our parents, we don't even know what it feels like to be them. And so often I don't know I think for me when I was younger and I had issues with my parents and then I have my own kids, I'm like, oh, okay, now that makes more sense. And so I think at each stage we're going to have that new awareness and wisdom. And so trying to find that before we get there to say, I don't know what it feels like to be 80. But I want to try to understand, and I want to try to be open to connecting about that. And then recognizing that we all need to be free to make choices and decisions that reflect who we are. And I think this idea often happens when we have older parents who their choice is maybe they don't want to get a particular treatment, or maybe they don't want to go live somewhere else yet. And I think those are so hard. But I think we have to value and respect the dignity of every person to say if they don't want to get treatment, and that may mean less years of their life, that is their choice to make. And how do we come alongside them and be supportive and love them rather than judgmental? And I have some where they don't want to tell their kids if they have an issue because they don't want their kids to judge them for what they're doing versus tell me, if you're going through something hard, tell me. It's okay. You're making your own choice for your own health care. That's not mine to make. It's yours. Because you want them to be open. And same thing with kids. If they're expecting judgment about their choices, they're going to keep secrets rather than tell me, what was that party like? What happened? Were those good decisions? Were those people you want to hang out with? Tell me about it. And so we create an open space where they talk about what's going on rather than hiding it, denying it, making it secrets, and then it festers and becomes its own problem. So I think just this fundamental truth that we all need to feel seen and known and valued. for the core of who we are. And again, I think that kind of comes from all those formative stages, that at each stage, when we have that sense that we're seen and known and valued, that's where maturity comes from. That's where we're more unoffendable, because we have this inherent sense of worth. So we're not approaching every interaction with the need to prove ourselves or the need to be affirmed for who we are. We have this sense internally, and so we can approach things more open and curious rather than expecting and judging. Thoughts, questions?
So that we can be supportive, because that is such a,
That's
for
a tricky
me,
one.
I'm an only child. So what you're telling me to do, or what you're, letting my mom be, I cannot do that. And so, but I would like to be, because my mom is shutting down a little bit, talking with me because she has some issues. So how do I get from where I'm at and somewhere in between what you're saying I should be doing?
I wonder, and I don't know the relationship with your mom, but I think going back to that triangle, like what kind of relationship are we creating with them? And so I think when a parent is saying they don't want to do something, rather than, well, you should, or you need to, or what about this, to say, tell me more about that. I know this is scary, or I know this is hard, or what's going on? What else is going on? Like, I think the more we can hear what's going on with them, they feel heard and seen and valued, and more likely than to maybe be able to have kind of that mutual respect. But I think when we're like, no, you have to do this, I can't believe you wouldn't do that, they feel disrespected. And part of it is, it's like kind of, I think we talked about the kids, adolescents growing up, and I'm going to either please my parents or I'm going to spite them. I think the older generation can do that to their parents. It's like, okay, I'll do everything you want, even though maybe it doesn't feel good for me. I'll move into this nursing home, even though that feels depressing and awful. Or spite them, and no way, I'm going to prove to you that I'm fine. I'm not going to do that. Because we're pushing rather than being like, this is your choice to make. Help me understand how you're making it. What are you thinking about, that's helping you come up with this decision? And empower them to make a decision and enter into it with them, rather than assuming or molding or demanding what you want them to do. It's tough. It's tough, and I think that's the ultimate thing. Like, so a big part about mental wellness is this idea of an internal versus an external locus of control. An external locus of control means things happen outside of us and they're not ours to we can't fix them or change them, and so put our hands up and nothing we can do. The internal locus is, I have choices that I can make, and I can act on that knowing that I cannot control anyone else, I can only control me. And I think the more that we live that way with our relationships, it's true, it's empowering. Like, God, he could control us, I suppose. He doesn't. He knows we make choices all the time that may not be for our good, and yet held and free, I think, is exactly the way that model of love is. That I'm here, and to be able to say, I'm concerned, it makes me sad that you wouldn't do that. I'm worried about your health and your safety, and I know that you're able to make that decision. Unless, they're in a point where they're cognitively not able to make those decisions, and I think that's where it crosses into a different category, when they're disabled to make those decisions.
Would you mind going back to the slide where you had the green, red, yellow, and black? Yeah. So that's, I understand obviously boundaries are very important, but it feels like that's just an escalating way of an argument. And in the earlier slides that you showed, it discussed that you could grow during any part of the 9 stages, right? And looking at this, I mean, it doesn't feel like there's any growth anywhere there. It just sort of ends with, I would call it like silent shouting by leaving the relationship, basically. And I mean, if we look at it sort of biblically, we're supposed to love our neighbor as much as ourselves. So hopefully your family members, yourself, and both the older generation and the younger generation can demonstrate that love as well. So how do we grow or use some tools to grow in between instead of just jumping from green to yellow to red to black?
I mean, I think the hope is that there are many that I think can stop at green. I think if it's done in a respectful way and that you've cultivated the relationship and the connection such that you say, hey, for example, with my parents, my father would make comments that I felt were inappropriate. I'd say, hey, I wish you wouldn't say that. And he quit. It was an awareness like, oh, okay, that's offensive, and I'm stopped. So I'm done with green. We grew and we changed and we've done. So at this progression is that if that doesn't work, then yeah, there's the next level where you say, if you keep talking like that, then I'm not going to continue in this conversation. So I think the idea is that hopefully at any of these stages, when we are more firm and clear, that it does create growth.
So let's say it doesn't happen. Are there some actions we can take after setting the initial boundary in order to make enough progress to yellow or red?
Well, I mean, I think that's where if we want to say, if you talk like this, I think we need to discontinue the conversation. Do you want to give me a more specific?
Would it be a good idea to go to, is there a third party to get involved, or are there classes we could take together, or, I mean,
Yeah.
what are the kind of actions we could take to facilitate or help growth rather than just going, okay, I did green, so now I'm going to yellow since you repeated it?
I hear what you're saying. Yeah, no, I think that's a great idea. And again, I think it's kind of you're deciding what the boundary is. I think that's one to say maybe we need to go and well, like for example, when I was talking about the abuse, maybe the green is, hey, we need to go to marriage counseling because this is not safe or good. We try that, or we need to have some clear guidance or whatever. So I think, yeah, at each stage, whatever your boundary is, that's yours to create. That's yours to say again, but it's not to say, it's saying, if we can't do this, then I will leave. And I think that's the key part is not, I think I have some people who are like, well, my boundary is that you have to not talk like this. And they keep enforcing quit talking versus I will leave if that happens because again, it's you are making the action choice of what you can't control, even with the third party. There are a lot of spouses, they're like, I'm trying to get my husband to come to therapy, he won't. And so at that point, do you continue? The escalation is there's a point where you go years and years of trying and hoping and asking, and the disrespect or abuse keeps happening, and there's a time where you're like, I can't take part in this anymore. I will make a choice to leave.
No, I understand all of that. I guess, how do you break the cycle? Question. Yeah, with our parents. How do you break the cycle in general?
So if they knew that they were not going to have, that you would take a break, if that conversation goes that way and you say, okay, we're going to need to leave now, you don't think maybe the next time they'd be a little bit more careful?
They might not even understand why.
Well, that's why you make a clear, kind, assertive boundary that explains this feels hurtful when you talk like this, or when you do this, this is hurtful and we're not going to continue. We're leaving tonight. We'll come over again next week. We'll try it again.
So I think, so we're both only child. And so with our parents, when where you say the boundary, I've done where I didn't talk, with my mom, and she refuses, and then but these are her only grandchildren. And I think what this looking at this is sort of my mom is who she is. My in-laws are who they are. And what I'm hearing you say is the boundary, you set the boundary in the conversation, and it's sort of like I listen to a sermon and it says, well, and today is the next day. Today is a different day. God is giving you, it's a new start. And then I have to start over again. But yesterday didn't change. And then tomorrow is the next day. And so I'm always setting a boundary, but it doesn't change. And as my mom, I am exhausted. You know, it's not changing. Our boys now have partners. We are now grandparents. And it's sort of watching. So I mean, like the boundary thing, it's with your kids and your spouse. But this is really, I don't know how to deal with it. I don't know how to apply it with my mom, except, well, all right, tomorrow we'll start over.
Well, again,
Does that,
kind of, but I think that idea is you're just staying at green over and over and over and over, and you're not recognizing there is an escalation. And they say that phrase, what the definition of crazy is, doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome. And so you're exhausted because it feels like I'm doing this over and over. And that's the idea of an escalation that says, okay, this isn't working. We're not going to come over tomorrow, you know, or whatever it might, whatever your thing is. But that's the rocking the boat, because we feel like, oh, but if we don't and they don't, they won't see the kids. Or I think that's the same thing with rescue. If I don't rescue this time, it might be really bad. But until you don't know. And until you say, this is the boundary, and there's consequences that happen when it's broken, and we'll try again next month, maybe. I don't know. That's where, again, I'm not saying what the boundary is, but you deciding when you're feeling like I'm doing this over and over and over, that's not listening to your own internal compass, kind of.
Isn't there a point at which we need to have more discussion to even understand why something is a boundary? Because many times people see the same thing and they have totally different views of it. Mm-hmm. And it just seems like currently we have in our culture, so many people have set these boundaries, and, you know, discussions are totally cut off. Mm-hmm. So I think communication, and a lot of communication is part of it, because many times what someone says isn't necessarily how you perceive that what they meant.
Yeah.
And if we can break down some of those and understand more. I was reading the book, Josh McDowell, The New Tolerance, and trying to understand the difference between what we thought of as tolerance and what young people think of as tolerance. Because so many times young people identify you with whatever it is that you think, rather than it's you and your ideas are separate. Yeah. So then if you have an idea that they don't like, then suddenly they're emotionally against you instead of just the idea. So don't we need to try to come to grips, you know, you're my mom, I love you, you know, and we can discuss these other things, but, you know, you're always going to be my mom, regardless of, you know, the boundaries we set in some ways, but you're always going to be my mom, and I'm always going to love you, and we're always going to have an interaction. And the same thing with grandchildren. These are your grandparents. Now, you love them because of that. Now, they have some different ideas than you have, but those are ideas. Those are separate from them.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And the next session is going to be on how do we create those conversations. And so kind of between which is first, the boundary or the conversation or the boundary. You can't have a conversation sometimes unless there's a boundary in place that allows this respect. So yeah, I think that's absolutely. And hopefully that's the goal, is not cutting off all our relationships, but entering into our relationships in a different way. I think the difference is, my husband uses this explanation of, a particular person in a relationship is like kind of a three-legged blind dog who's awkward and uncomfortable and has difficulty getting around, but okay. But when that three-legged blind dog bites my child, that's not okay. And so I think that's the idea with grandparents, or, you know, so there's differences of opinion. Yeah, how do we learn to be kind and respectful and curious? What makes you think that way? You know, discussion. But if it becomes a point where that person is hurtful, then that's where these boundaries are important. And so I think that's kind of the distinction, is a firm boundary is like particularly Black in abuse. You know, when there's a clear abusive, and it can be emotionally abusive as well, that is hurtful of that other person, that's where it's important, parent or not, to say, this is not okay. Out of protection for myself, I will create this boundary. But when it's just differences of opinion, a little argumentative, we're reactive, that's where we learn, how do we discuss differently? How do we engage differently? Because the difference of opinion, no one's being hurt by that unless it's an attacking kind of comment. Does that make sense?
Although some people currently, when they think that you are your idea, they do feel hurt by it.
And I think that, again, is a modeling thing, because I think we do that to the younger generation and they do it to the older generation. So therefore, because you think this way politically or whatever, you're ignorant or you're sophisticated, you know, you're lazy, whatever it is. And so I think, yeah, on both sides, being aware that ideas and values can be different and we can still have mutual respect for each other. Over here?
David, the reason we're doing this is because we want to get the questions on the recording. This is going to be is being recorded, so I'm not sure exactly when it will be online for you. It has to be, you know, a couple tweaks to it, but that's why we're doing this, so people can hear your question.
Yeah, so in the escalation, it's almost as if this is a conversation with someone that said something offensive rather than a family member. And, you know, taking a break for 5 minutes may or may not matter with a family member that's just going to keep at it. So is that yellow? Sometimes, look, we're going to
go home?
And we'll be back in a week. If you've changed your mind, great. But if it's more of the same, then maybe we won't be back for a month or 2 months. And just
Again,
until
yeah.
that person makes a choice, it's never going to change.
Yeah.
Because they have to want to.
They have to want to. Yeah, and you're saying you can believe, like I had a person who said, who had written a hurtful letter to my child and created a division in the relationship, and then said, I'm sorry, our theological differences have gotten in the way of our relationship. And I said, it's not our theological differences. You can believe whatever you want to believe. You can raise your children however you want to raise them. But when you tell me how I have to raise my kids, or you say something hurtful to my child, that's the break. You know, you can believe whatever you want. That's fine. And so I think that's the key part, is that we can have differences of opinion, but when that becomes hurtful to ourselves or someone that we love, that's where we need to protect. And I think when it's our kids, it's important not to be like, oh, it's just grandma and grandpa. That's the way they talk. It's all okay. Just get over it. Show up, give them a hug, be nice. What's that message is saying, how you feel doesn't really matter. Hide your feelings. Just show up, be pleasing, do the right thing. And is that what we want our kids to realize, or do we want our kids to hear, I know that's hurtful, what's being said, and we don't need to keep going as long as they're going to do that, because I'm going to protect you from something that feels hurtful. So again, I think it's just there's that distinction between, is it hurtful or is it just a difference of opinion?
It's funny that I've been noticing something, an interesting dynamic in some of our family gatherings, where I know the politics are, you know, very different. I've been seeing people, spouses with whom I know I might disagree, chastising not my own spouse, but another person. Yeah, let me rephrase that. That's why I'm here, to learn better communication. But I've seen other people chastising their own spouse for, like, getting in, making political comments when I know that the person who's chastising them disagrees with me. So I think that's a healthy thing. In other words, they're realizing that, hey, those kinds of things get at family gatherings, which we've got several coming up these days. Those things are not good. So it's kind of nice to see that. And the thing I guess I'm trying to keep my eyes on is, who is the person behind the politics? Who is that individual to me? And I'm finding I can find that. I don't always have to look hard for it, but I can find that. And has been for me the commonality. I find that same kind of dynamic in the church and in the different theological disagreements that we have. You know what? There's a commonality, and particularly in Christ, that's bigger than all those things. Right. So for me, that with that bottom line, it kind of helps me get through some of those other things. It's not foolproof, but
no, absolutely. And that's the idea of you're connecting to the person. Like you were saying, Nancy, it's not the idea. It's like these ideas can swim all around, but there's a heart-to-heart connection that we can make. And I think when people really feel seen and valued and heard, they're more likely to not engage in that same hurtful way, to be able to say, well, tell me more about that. How did you come up with that belief? What's that mean to you? Just being curious, and we'll talk more about that. But then I also was going to say, I think kind of back to what you were saying, there may be times where in a family gathering, the politics always kind of creates eruption to say, that's going to be off limits. We're just not going to go there. We have different beliefs. It's okay, but we don't need to argue about that. And I think some people, again, my husband's not here, so I keep kind of, he's a very bold, strong, assertive kind of person who, when he has an opinion, and early on in our marriage, I'm like, I don't want to argue about this. He's like, I'm not arguing. He was just forcefully sharing his opinion, but it felt like arguing to me. And so he's been one, and when you were saying the spouse, like often with the kids, he'll come back with his very, strongly held opinion. But what it does is it demeans the kids, because in the way he's doing it, it makes them feel dismissed or unheard or like they're stupid. And I know that's not his intention, but I think he's been great to be able to kind of let me be like, yeah, you're kind of going too much on this one, and to be able to change and to recognize, for the sake of the relationship, he needs to be able to engage differently, or he's going to sever the relationship. And again, it's on him to change. The kids will just not want to have those conversations unless he can be inviting in a way that there's space that feels safe. So I think
one of the reasons I mentioned that, I was thinking of it, Shabana's point, that our love for our family, that's a powerful thing. It makes it tough when there needs to be some kind of boundary, but it also is something that makes us want to try to work it out, I think, at least.
Yeah, and I think
it gives you more effort.
That's the point of growth, because I think if we it's like our children, right? When they were little and we say, don't touch that, or you're going to get a timeout, and they touch it and we don't give them a timeout or whatever. It's like we say it over and over and over. It never changes. But when you finally take an action and say, or, we're not going to stay at the park if you're not going to play nice, whatever. And it happens, and we actually take them and we put them in the car, and they're kicking and screaming and they're throwing a tantrum, and it's awful for that moment. But the next time we go to the park, they're probably going to be a little bit more aware of what they're doing because they want to stay and play at the park. And so I think it's similar with our parents. If we say, don't do that, and they keep doing it, and we keep showing up and just kind of going through the same motion, it's different than a consequence that says there will be a broken relationship if that keeps happening. We don't want that. We love you. We want to be here. But if this keeps happening, it's going to break the relationship. And that allows them a chance to grow. And we don't know until they feel that broken relationship. I think for my husband, until he felt like, oh, this is actually impacting my relationship with my kids, I'm going to talk differently. I'm going to be aware, even this is my way and I'm not mad, I'm going to be aware of how I'm talking because I don't want to hurt this relationship.